What's up guys, it's Chili here, and today we're going to be talking about auto queue. I've got some gameplay going on in the background. It's my first time playing Freyr in a ranked match. Actually, this is my first time playing any ranked match or any multiplayer match in Age of Mythology Retold at all, in fact. So excuse me for the relatively newbie gameplay. For folks who don't know, I would definitely consider myself a more casual player. I peaked at about Conqueror 1 in Age of Empires 4, and for pretty much any competitive game I get into, I max out at like the diamond level. But for me, it's something that I'd rather play with my friends and just have some fun over rather than get really sweaty about it. Which is funny because I feel like I'm the exact kind of player that Boyd was describing in his recent video. But before I get ahead of myself, I should give some context on auto queue. What is auto queue? Auto queue is a feature in Age of Mythology, and we also saw it in the extended edition, where you can set your buildings to automatically produce units without you having to click on it. This is especially important when it comes to auto training your villagers. Villagers are the lifeblood of any civilization, and anyone who's ever played a competitive match will know that you need your villagers to ramp up your economy, and if you forget to produce them, then you're gonna quickly fall behind. Auto queue kind of gets around this problem by automatically producing villagers whenever you have the resources, so it takes one more thing off of your mind. Pretty controversial feature in the RTS community, and it's been discussed ad nauseum for many different games in the past as well. A lot of players feel like adding auto queue basically removes an element of skill from the game. Remembering to constantly produce villagers even while you're getting attacked, even while you're attacking from multiple fronts, is one of the things that distinguishes a good player from a great player. On the other hand, a lot of people feel like auto queue is providing an essential quality of life feature to help accessibility in the game. This is especially important for noobs or people who are not familiar with RTS games, who are just trying to ramp up and haven't built that muscle memory of constantly training villagers. This topic has been recently discussed both by Boyd and also by Beastie QT, and definitely check out their videos. They give some pretty interesting takes, and I think it's really healthy for us as a community to kind of discuss this. If I had to summarize things, I think for Beastie, he's open to auto queue specifically in that it'll help new players get into the game, and this will help grow the RTS or Age of Mythology or Age of Empires community. But at the same time, he doesn't quite want to see it on the pro level. He feels like it takes away from some of the skill expression in the game. So his compromise is basically have auto queue for the new players, but give it like a 10% increased training time or something like that, just to incentivize people who really want to get good at the game to not use auto queue. On the other hand, to summarize Boyd's video, I don't think he explicitly took a side. I think he's also of the opinion that whatever helps grow the community is what's best. I think both players kind of want to preserve the integrity of competitive RTS while making the compromises necessary to help the game grow and just become more successful. And this will obviously help the content creator community here as well. Now for me, I have a slightly more, I think, uncompromising take here. And if you clicked on this video, you probably already know where I stand on this. To me, I think auto queuing is obvious. And in fact, it's a must-have in pretty much any RTS game of this type. And by of this type, I mean any kind of age-style RTS game where you're building villagers, building buildings, and then training units. So maybe auto queue wouldn't be as obviously relevant to Company of Heroes, where you don't really have to do any kind of villager macro. But for any game similar to Age of Empires, I absolutely think it's essential. But let me clarify here. Let me tell you why. First of all, there's a lot of different kinds of auto queues. You can have villager-only auto queue. You can have villager and military auto queue, where also your military production buildings can be toggled to automatically produce units. You can have the Beastie method, where the time it takes to train them is a little bit longer. You can have a system where players on the ladder can handshake to agree whether or not to enable auto queue for their game. There's a lot of different approaches here. For me, I'm specifically saying that villager auto queue is an absolute must. And my reasoning for this is simple. Not building villagers is not an actual option in this game. The way that these games are currently balanced, the amount of value per resource spend that you get from building a villager is so insanely high that there's absolutely never a reason to not build a villager, at least up until you hit around the 100 to 120 villager mark. You're never gonna have a game where you actually ask yourself, oh, do I not build a villager here and build a military unit instead? Or rather, the cases in which that happens is so rare and so niche that it's not something that the game should design for. And in fact, even presenting the option that you can choose not to train villagers is a tar pit specifically designed to kill noobs. At this point, I've taught so many of my friends how to play Age of Empires 4, and the hardest lesson for every single one of them is remembering to constantly build villagers. And what I found is that this has been kind of the great filter. Players who can figure out how to constantly build villagers will stick with the game, and players who can't get over this hump sadly fall off. And this is because building villagers is what allows you to play the game in Age of Empires. It's kind of like trying to play pickleball without a paddle. The villagers are the paddle. In my opinion, where the skill comes in is how you hold the paddle, how you wield the paddle, and how you hit with it. It's not as meaningful of a skill check to say, did you bring a paddle and did you remember to keep holding onto it in the middle of the game? Call me crazy, but that just seems a lot less interesting to me. In other words, it's not about training the villagers, but rather how you distribute them, what resources you gather, and what are the strategic choices that you're making when you're playing the game. I come from the world of game design, and there's this concept known as time to fun. Whenever you're building a game, you want to get your player to the fun as smoothly and as quickly as you can. This is how you get people to stick. This is the high that players are going to be chasing when they want to queue up again. So I want to point that question to you, dear listener. What is the fun for you? Is clicking the villager training button all that fun? For most people, probably not. RTS games are about building up your empire and, more importantly, fighting against another player's empire. The tactics that you wield build in battle, the units that you train, the plays that you pull off, whether with your god powers or with your siege units or your flanks, those are the things that get you excited. In other words, the player-to-player interactions. In my view, auto queue is a way to get players to that player-to-player interaction faster, get the players to the fun faster. And it's not like there's no skill expression involved either. Again, how you distribute your resources, how you choose to spend your resources, how you choose to micro your units, all of these are still very relevant skill areas. And speaking of player-to-player interaction, I don't even think that constantly building villagers is a good skill check in this game. The reason why is that you as a player will not know if your opponent is failing to build villagers. Let's say you're doing a really good job raiding them, attacking them from multiple fronts. You will have no idea whether or not your opponent is going to be struggling to produce villager or miss macroing because of that. And in fact, nothing that you do as an opponent can actually directly impact whether or not the other player is going to be making villagers or not. And even if you do overwhelm them, there's no way for you to know how many villagers they fail to produce. So it becomes really hard to actually get a gauge of what their economy might look like. In other words, it's a self-skill issue. It's like you're in a boxing match and you're counting on whether or not the other player is going to forget how to breathe. This just makes it even harder for newer players to get a feel for what the proper timings are for this game. Let's say I'm getting my base rush down, but my opponent is forgetting to build vills the whole time. While on paper that should be good for me, I actually don't know that he was forgetting to build vills this whole time. And it's also not necessarily something I can just assume. Even if I scout his base and I don't see enough vills, it would just make me think that he's hiding vills elsewhere. This makes the game much more confusing. I can't make an informed strategic decision here because there's information I simply can never get access to. If there was something like a global villager counter where I can see whether or not my opponent's making the mistake, maybe that could help cover up for this, but I don't think any of us actually want that feature. And another thing to add on top of this, vills are like mana in Hearthstone. They're your ramp. Having a constant flow of villagers guarantees the progression of the game. This is one of the reasons why noob games tend to last for so long, because neither side is making villagers. Players don't hit the last age until like the 50-minute mark. And anyone who's ever played an hour-long game of Age of Empires or Age of Mythology knows that that's one of the more painful experiences that you can have in gaming. It's not something that we should be pushing newer players towards. Also in the discussions, I saw a lot of people comparing building villagers to dribbling in basketball. While I get that this is a core mechanic in both games, one big difference to keep in mind here is that dribbling is a very visual activity, and there's a lot of cool spectatable skill expression from dribbling. The same thing goes for footwork in soccer, or football for you Europeans. When a player makes an outplay with dribbling, spectators can actually appreciate that. When a player remembers to queue villagers in an RTS game, this is not like an oh wow moment. There's no like visual spectacle here. It's just like, oh, they've remembered to press the button and now they get another villager. I love watching Aussie Drongo videos. I do that shit all the time. And I think he casts the games perfectly because he really does a good job of highlighting the strategic decisions that players are making, as well as the actual in-battle micro. That's the cool stuff. That's the stuff that really stands out. The Empire and Villager macro is also neat, but you'll never hear Aussie Drongo say, oh my god, he remembered to build his villagers. There's just nothing sexy about that. In the design world, we have this concept known as a design razor. Whatever game you're designing, think about what you're prioritizing. In a strategy game, you should be prioritizing strategic decisions. What makes one player better than another player in a strategy game, like in Age of Mythology, should be, did this person make better strategic decisions? And if you have a mechanic that is fundamentally not a strategic decision, because building a villager is obvious, and you will never need to strategically think about whether or not you should be building a villager here, then in my view, I don't think that's a good feature. But for any folks who thinks that this takes away from the skill depth of the game, let me propose an alternative. I don't think queuing villagers is a very exciting thing to see, and it's also not an exciting thing to do as a player. But what is a little bit more interesting is how you choose to set up your macro, how you choose to lay out your base, which resources you're going to try to go for, which areas of the map that you are going to try to defend. One of the reasons I really like Age of Empires 4, and this is something I really hope Age of Mythology takes lessons on moving forward, is the influence system, where different civilizations' buildings will give you bonuses that affect how you choose to lay out your base. This forces players to think very strategically. Base building is no longer just leave your buildings wherever. If you haven't tried Age of Empires 4, I highly recommend it for this reason. I think instead of pressing Q on your TC a few times every single minute, it'd be far more interesting if there were more proximity or influence style mechanics in the game that really affects how players choose to plan the layout of their base to maximize for different kinds of resources. One of the best examples of this is the Byzantines in AoE 4. They have cisterns that buff up the resource gathering of all the villagers nearby, but the problem with cisterns is that they cost stone and they're pretty expensive, and building them takes a long time, and you need to build an aqueduct that connects your cistern to the rest of your empire. So if you build it too far out, you're taking a significant risk. But this kind of mechanic is a lot more interesting, and it can also show player personality. We can see which players choose to take that risk, which players don't. I think for me, if I was to design my ideal version of an RTS game, I'd want to introduce more modern concepts into it, like something like Factorio. In Factorio, you're basically writing algorithms, building out these factories to pump out different resources and pipe them through different channels so that you can ultimately improve your tech tree. This is a great foundation for an RTS. In fact, that aspect of like optimizing your algorithm on the fly in real time and then challenging players to do that based on a randomly generated map against another player, I think that'd be super exciting. And I think it will also appeal to a lot lot of the fans of RTS games. I feel like there's a lot of engineers that play RTS games. For whatever reason, this seems to appeal to that demographic. Having a more algorithm-based approach to your base building and civilization design could be a ton of fun, and I've yet to see any game try to do that yet. So yeah, in other words, auto queue, I recognize that it's not the ideal solution, and to an extent it does take away from some of the skill expression of the game, at least what the skill expression was traditionally, but instead it opens up so much more opportunity for where the designers could take the game next. Maybe as more RTS games adopt auto queue, they can add complexity to other areas that make your civilization building and base building a lot more interesting, and that will result in much more interesting games in my opinion. So in conclusion, I'm really glad that auto queue was added to Age of Mythology. I think it's going to take a little bit of getting used to for competitive players who are coming in from other games, but in the long run, I really hope that Age of Empires 4 and every other similar RTS game out there adopts the same mechanic so that we can start exploring what's next, which could be more interesting base building, more Factorio style resource management, and hopefully as a result more interesting player expression, which would then lead into more viewership and then a revival of the RTS community, and before long we'll have a new generation of RTS players on our hands. And I know that most of us who like the Age games and like RTS games tend to skew on the older side, but we have to recognize that while there's a nostalgic market for us, this is not what the future of this game genre is going to be. Most of us have families or jobs that are just taking up all of our time. We don't have the time to play anymore. So if you want to see this genre grow and excel, you have to be willing to adopt changes that will make this game more appealing to younger audiences. Alright, that's enough yapping from me. I went on a lot longer about this than I thought I would. Let me know what you think about what I said in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video at all, I would love it if you would subscribe or at least like the video. That's all from me, folks. Until next time, stay frosty, stay chilly.